So today we're going to dive into a really fascinating defense of the faith of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're going to break down how one author uses a parable that's, 2,000 years old as a modern framework for responding to some of the most persistent criticisms out there.
But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a conversation, maybe a debate, with someone who is just impossible to please? It's like no matter what you say or do, they're just determined to find fault. It's super frustrating, right? Well, that exact experience is the core idea that frames the entire argument in the treatise we're covering today.
All right, here's a quick look at where we're headed. We'll start with that central parable, then we'll get into a really interesting contrast the author draws from Shakespeare of all places. After that, we'll see how this whole framework gets applied to both historical and modern criticisms. And finally, we'll land on what the author calls the ultimate rebuttal.
So the whole argument, the entire thing, is built on one single, really powerful metaphor from the New Testament. It's a parable that Jesus himself used to describe the critics of his own time.
And here it is, the core concept, the children in the marketplace. The author pulls this right out of the Gospel of Luke. The idea is that some critics are kind of like fickle children. If you suggest a happy game, they won't play. If you suggest a sad game, they won't play that either. They're not actually interested in playing the game. They're just interested in complaining about it.
The treatise really highlights how Jesus uses this very parable. I mean, look at this. John the Baptist comes along, living this super strict, austere life. And what do the critics say? He has a devil. Then Jesus comes. He's sociable, he eats with all sorts of people, and they call him a glutton. You see? Two totally opposite approaches, and both get rejected. The author argues that this is the exact no-win situation that believers often find themselves in today.
Now, to make this contrast even sharper, the author pulls in a powerful foil from a really unexpected source, Shakespeare's Macbeth. This whole comparison is meant to set up a stark choice between a worldview of divine purpose and one of just total, utter meaninglessness.
So the treatise presents Macbeth's famous speech here as the logical endpoint of a life lived without any divine counsel. It's a worldview where all the drama, all the struggle of life, it ultimately signifies nothing. The author's point is that this is the kind of spiritual vacuum that relentless, cynical criticism can lead to.
And boom, right after that feeling of despair, the treatise hits us with this verse, which is the actual conclusion to Jesus' parable. But wisdom is justified of all her children. So what does that mean? Well, this is the crucial point. The author argues you don't prove truth by winning a debate with a fickle critic. You prove it by the results, the children, it produces in the lives of the people who actually live it.
Okay, so with that whole framework established, the impossible to please critics on one side and wisdom proven by its fruits on the other, the author now starts applying it to specific historical attacks against the church.
This gives you a good snapshot of the approach. When critics say Joseph Smith was just a con man, the rebuttal is to look at the fruits, his life's work and ultimate sacrifice, as evidence of his sincerity. When people point out that accounts of his first vision changed, the treatise explains it as a pretty common historical practice, emphasizing different details for different audiences. And for really tough topics like polygamy and the past priesthood ban, the author reframes them, not as products of lust or racism, but as difficult, often misunderstood commandments and policies that existed within a larger context of gradual revelation.
So from there, the treatise pivots away from the 19th century and brings us right into the present day, using that exact same framework to talk about critiques of modern church doctrine and practices.
The author just tackles this one head-on, because it's a criticism you hear a lot, and it usually comes from a place of not really knowing what goes on. The idea that temple ceremonies are secretive, or even creepy.
The defense laid out here makes a really key distinction. Temple worship isn't secret, it's sacred, and it's rooted in ancient biblical patterns. But the most powerful rebuttal is this parallel to Jesus' symbolic language. The author basically says, look, when Jesus told people to pluck out thy eye, he wasn't being literal, right? He was teaching a higher law. In the same way, the symbolism in the temple is meant to teach, not to be taken as some literal, creepy instruction. And then there's this, another doctrine that gets distorted all the time, exaltation. You've probably heard the criticism simplified down to Mormons believe they'll become gods. Well, the author reframes it by going straight to the Bible, to Romans, defining it as becoming joint heirs with Christ, which means inheriting all that God has. It's presented as a much more nuanced and biblically supported idea.
This slide hits on a few other modern critiques. You've got the rich corporation charge, and the treatise frames the church's finances as a matter of stewardship for a global mission.
To the claim that women are sidelined, it points to their leadership roles in massive global organizations. And against that old idea that members are brainwashed, it emphasizes core doctrines like personal revelation and moral agency, summed up in that call to choose ye this day whom ye will serve.
And this brings us to the final and maybe most important point. After going through all these specific criticisms with logic and context, the author kind of shifts gears completely, arguing that, in the end, intellectual debate just isn't the final answer.
So this poses the million-dollar question that the entire treatise has been building up to. If you can't satisfy the children in the marketplace with reason and logic alone, what's left? What is the final rebuttal?
And there it is. That's the author's answer. It's a complete move from the head to the heart. The argument concludes that the ultimate proof isn't going to be found in a historical document or a philosophical debate. It's found in a personal, spiritual witness that, for the author, is more certain than anything they can see with their own eyes.
And so this whole analysis leaves us with a really powerful final question. It brings us right back to the beginning, that contrast between Macbeth's despair and Luke's children of wisdom. The author is ultimately asking us to consider whether real truth is something that can be proven in an argument or if it's something that's validated by the way you live your life.